Okay, so a few announcements at the top. So one, if you did, I just started grading all the discussion boards from Sunday. So if you didn't complete it, I think everybody here
Woo!
completed it. But if you didn't, go back and do it. It's worth your time for those 25 points to go back and do it, and to do it now. If you start skipping those assignments because they seem like they're small, very quickly they're going to start adding up, because on weeks when you don't have a longer paper due, we're going to have these smaller assignments. So don't get behind, right? My brother, when he was in college, liked to describe falling behind as quicksand. Once you fall behind a little
Get out of
bit,
there. Don't
it
get in
becomes
there.
easier and easier
I
to fall
want to make
behind,
my
and
No.
you don't want to do that. Like, I'm gonna mute you, Leslie, just I think you hadn't realized it was on. But and I don't want anybody to fall on that, because you never know when you might actually need more time for another reason. So go back and do those if you haven't done them already. The discussion board post for today. Let me share my screen and take us there. Sorry, not for today, for Sunday. It's both under assignments, but also under the modules week 3. Is based on the reading, or I like to say, or the discussion, the lectures from Monday, Wednesday. Really, because we go over a lot of these questions when we talk about the readings. You know, you can be strategic in how you approach that. But by the end of today, you should be able to answer all of these questions and go get it out of the way. Right? I know things are starting to pile up with all your classes, and this one should not take an exorbitant amount of time. How long did you guys take last week in the discussion board post? Any, so I can, so it helps me know how long it's taking you, because I might be thinking, oh, it only takes 20 minutes, when in reality it takes an hour. How long did you guys take to do it?
I don't think I took that long. I thought it was pretty easy. Well, not easy in the sense where I used to know everything, but I thought the questions were straightforward. I didn't think it took that long for me to get my thoughts together.
Okay, so I'm like, but some of you who are saying, oh, easy, make 20-25 minutes, and that should be about how much time the upperclassmen, especially if you're a history major, should be taking. If you haven't taken a history class in college ever or in a while, then it might be taking a little bit longer. Sorry, and it's like I rushed it 15 minutes. I haven't gotten to it. Some of you, all the posts that I saw, when you were writing a good amount in that, so the appropriate amount, like what I wanted. If you're not writing enough, I will let you know. But so far, everything looks good. So whatever you're doing so far, you want to keep doing it. Hopefully, these questions today for this week will be a little bit shorter. But you'll let me know. Like, let me know when it's too much, because that's something I can control, and I'm more than happy to amend some of those discussion board posts to a more appropriate and reasonable time. Right? Okay. So let's continue then talking about the reading, because you want to be able to answer the rest of the questions that are on this discussion board post. But I left you all hanging last on Monday because I didn't talk about the Blood Maiden. So for those of you that are following along, if you have the reading up, it's on page 17, and this comes from the Popol Vuh, the Mayan origin story. Uh, so does anybody want to give us the recap of what the Mayan origin story is? Does anybody remember it? No, it's sorry, on page 17. It's the Popol Vuh, that it starts with two kind of gods, a female god and a male god. They don't have, well, the names are, um, what is it? He who engenders children and she who bears children. Right? That's really interesting to me that those are the names there. And it starts with they give birth to twins, right? But the twins are kind of get into some trouble when they go to the underworld. They go to the underworld to play a game of ball. Right? And then what happens? Does anybody remember what happens to the twins in the underworld?
I think they get killed by the lords there.
Yes, they get killed in the underworld, but one of them has pieces of it that survives. The head, the head of Hun Hunapu survives, right? And so the head is thrown into a tree.
Yes.
And then what?
That's when I think the whole Blood Maiden, or is that a little after?
No, no, yeah, that's part of it, right? Uh, by throwing
Gives
the head
birth.
of this twin into the tree, it makes the tree like being able to like bear fruit. The tree then bears fruit. Yes. And this young woman is walking by this tree, and she doesn't even have to eat the fruit. She just speaks to its fruit. It says,
Yeah,
right?
she speaks to it.
And she gets pregnant. So the woman is called the Blood Maiden, right? Because she becomes pregnant. She gives birth to twins, and then they're able to take over, right? Yeah, and the thing that always interests me about some of these origin stories, right, is like, why, right? They created these stories, right? So why, if you're, a Mayan, why would you create a story that involves somebody getting pregnant by talking to fruit of a tree? Why would you create a story like this? If you're sitting down to write the story of how were created, you're coming up thinking of all the possibilities. Why in the world would you come up with a tree and somebody getting pregnant just by like talking to a tree?
Is it like, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of Eve from the Garden of Eden because she eats the apple and it's like knowledge and wisdom. And so it's something seen as like dangerous or like don't do it or you will get pregnant and die. Like,
Yeah, so one thing that's interesting there, right? The parallels, right? What is it with trees and these origin stories, right? It tells us that trees to a lot of these communities all over the globe are important, right? As a source of food, probably. And food is connected to like life, right? Without food, you don't eat. So that might be a possibility why trees as being like play such an important role, and their fruit plays such an important role in some of these stories. Someone was going to add something. I saw another mic off. Yeah.
I was just gonna say I was just gonna say I think it just represented like them trying to make sense of the world, and in the same way I think that in the same way that children grow, in the same way that trees grow, like I guess that's the correlation they were trying to make.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing is like their sense of the supernatural, right? Is just it feels very real to them because they are at the mercy of a very violent, ever-changing world. I mean, we still are, but it feels very real to them because, their life, a small change in the environment can completely change their lives. And I think that's one of the things that we see in a lot of these stories, why there's quite a bit of violence in them, right? That usually tells us that, the people who wrote the story live in a very violent world, very, very dependent on kind of nature, right? And that's a lot of times why we see gods being associated with different elements of nature. But there also seems to be, it's in quite a few of these origin stories, this like um, focus on pregnancy and birth, right? And it kind of an explanation of that. Like I think about the correlation between the Popol Vuh and the Bible story of Jesus, right? And the virgin birth, right? There's this need to connect humanity to the gods, right? To make that connection somewhere, and I think that's one way of doing it, right? By saying, aha, It's kind of the hand of God or the gods, right? And a human, right, mixing together and create something that then populates a species that will populate the earth. There's something about that combination of divinity, however it's imagined, and humanity that um, pops up in a lot of these different stories, right? What's another thing though, that in this particular chapter they focused a lot on family in these origin stories, right? Why? Again, I think we looked at this one on Monday, but why? They could have chosen a bunch of other topics to focus on this chapter. Why is this chapter talking so much about family? Silence. You can venture some guesses at this. I'm asking you a very open-ended question where there won't be a wrong answer. I'm asking you what you think, right? You didn't write this chapter, so you don't know for sure why it was written this way. But you can come up with it because it's based on religion. Yeah. Oh, and here, okay, I had missed a few of the comments here. Yes. The kinship is important to the family. This becomes a really important unit. The way each culture sees the family unit becomes important because it'll give us, an idea of how different roles were assigned in the community, especially in terms of gender, right? If a family unit is seen as a very close knit, just a man, a woman, and children, if that's the family unit, then that tells us a lot about gender roles and about the place of women in society. Especially, that's one of the things we're going to be interested in, because a lot of the societies that we're going to be looking at are patriarchal societies, right? So okay, if the men are in charge, what's the role of the women? Right? The men are in charge in a lot of these communities, but it doesn't mean that the women's role is the same in each one. We're going to see quite a bit of variation, right? Even within patriarchal societies, it can vary a lot. Right? So, does that make sense? I'll keep coming back to that. I'm going to be coming back to it so much that you're going to be sick of me talking about it. But hopefully it'll also be interesting, and that's why I really wanted this chapter, even though it talks about so many different religions, for you to see how there are some similarities. All the religions and societies that the chapter focuses on are patriarchal societies, but even within that, the role of women can vary significantly, and it sometimes challenges our ideas of what ancient people and ancient religions, how they viewed women and how women interacted within that role. Right? So, okay, let me share my screen again and talk a little bit more about kind of the formation of complex societies and monumental structures. Right? So we talked a lot about how, agriculture leads to settling down of communities. It's a slow process, but it's a very important process. It's important in terms of gender, but it's important of just the way societies organize themselves. So a few things that we're going to see a pattern all over more complex societies. So societies that have gone beyond small nomadic groups, right? They're no longer hunter and gatherers. When people settle down, they grow their communities, and that makes the communities complex, right? Notice I am not using the word civilization. I'm not going to use that word civilization. And whenever I use it, I always use it in air quotes. The problem with that word is that there's so much negative connotations attached to the word civilizations, right? It's been used as a way to, by Europeans to claim that they have a natural superiority to the rest of the world. And so I just avoid it, because what we see in complex societies is that they happen all over the world. It's not just one part of the world. They happen in the Americas. They happen in what we now call the Middle East, in Asia, in North Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. This process that we're going to look at of communities becoming more complex happens everywhere. They happen at different times, and it looks different in every place, but the process ends up being the same, right? One of the things we see as more people, communities grow, is that they create cities, right? They create cities. And in these cities, we see three key things. So these are the three key elements of a complex society, right? One is the monumental structure. The monumental structure is a key part of all of these complex societies all over the world. Social structure. So differences in class or just in social, there's a kind of social stratification that happens. Some people are more important and have more power than others. Right? That's a key element in a complex society. That inequality exists in some way, shape, or form in all of these communities. And then the third really important element that we're going to see in all of these communities is the development of writing. Right? Some of these communities it might take a while to develop writing, but eventually they all develop a way of communicating through the written form, right? And so complexity, as societies become more complex, they give us these three things. And I don't want to just focus on some of these, the Fertile Crescent area that we typically focus on, because that same process occurred in the Americas, right? The Americas usually get left out of this history of settling down and developing agriculture, but the same thing happened in this part of the world. It just happened later, right? And one of the places where we see these monumental structures is with the Olmec. How many of you have seen these? Most of you should be able to recognize the Olmec heads. Who has seen them before?
I've seen not like in person, but like on designs like shirts and like other stuff.
Yeah, sometimes they become, if you ever go to Peru, you will see them much, or not Peru. If you go to Central America, you'll see them a lot more. But even in your textbooks, usually this is something that comes up because it's not a pyramid, but it's still a huge chunk of rocks that were created by the Olmec, right? So they were created around 900 BCE. We've been able to date some of these rocks, right? But let me ask you, right? If we're looking at the Olmec heads, these giant rocks, right, that were carved to look like heads, if we look at them the same way we analyze the pyramids, what can these giant heads made out of rock tell us about the Olmec?
I was gonna say like they're very advanced with their technology and like their artistic abilities to like document what they look like at the time.
Yeah, the artistic level to be able to carve a huge rock, first of all, and then to put the kind of detail that they put into, like, look at the noses, the lips, the like helmet, whatever is on top of the head. It's highly detailed. I don't know how many of you could do that with a piece of rock, regardless of what size it is, right? What else do the heads tell us about the Olmec?
I'm guessing how the people looked back in the day, like
That is a
as
huge one.
themselves.
Yeah, that is a huge one. So one of the first things that scholars believed when they first found the heads was that maybe they were gods, right? In a lot of other places, a lot of the carvings represent gods or religious symbols, and we don't think that's the case with the Olmec heads. We don't think these are gods. We think that this is a representation of what the Olmec looked like. So they're carving these heads in their own image. Right now, more likely, it's probably an image that is supposed to look like maybe one of the leaders, maybe a powerful general, or a powerful priest. Even somebody who has some degree of power is probably going to be represented, but it's not meant to represent a god. This are humans, and so we think this tells us what the Olmec looked like, right? So yeah, absolutely. So these are kind of, these we do think are basically like selfies. But not everybody can create this kind of selfie of themselves, right? So the other thing this tells us, and I saw this in the chat, is also like how powerful the social structure, right? How stratified the social structure was for the Olmec, right? Because we know that it takes a lot of skill to create them, just to carve them. But the other kind of problem that they had to overcome to make these giant heads was getting the rock. We know that these rocks came from far away from where they stand now. Right? The mountain that these rocks came from would be found 60 miles away. 60 miles away. So do any of you want to volunteer to make me a giant head of that looks like me with rock that you have to carry 60? I am. Some of you would for extra credit again. But here's the problem. The Americas don't have the wheel. They don't yet have the wheel. So they don't have carts or like even any kind of like vehicle that can transport giant pieces of rock. So how the hell did they do this? How did they carve a rock from a mountain that was 60 miles away and then make it look like this? Any of the ideas of how they did this? Teamwork. Yeah, you would all volunteer together. Maybe 40 of you can carry a rock. Makes the dream work. The opposite, right? Nobody's volunteering for this. We think that, again, somebody had the power to make other people carry out this kind of labor, right? Like a colony of ants carrying the food, except this isn't food, right? Carving a rock is not going to ensure your survival. It's not going to feed you. It's not going to clothe you. It's not going to put a roof over your head. None of that. Right? It means that this society is advanced enough that they can have people engage in work that actually does not benefit the society at all. Right? The fact that you can force people to do this work and you don't need them to be working the fields. You don't need them or working at some other kind of specialty thing. You can spend hundreds of people just to carry a rock and carve it. Right? That means that it is a very complex and evolved society. Right. So we think actually that they did one of two things to carry these rocks, by the way, because they don't have the wheel. We think they're literally like pulling or, the rocks or pushing the rocks over land 60 miles. Or that they might have found some sort of body of water, because a body of water would have made it easy, right? You can put the giant rock on something and float it down a river. So that's one possibility. We don't know exactly. This is one of those things that is, we don't know the exact answer, but they had to have done one of those things because they carry the rocks. There's also then two possibilities of how some of this might have worked, that they either carved the rock at the mountain, at the base of the mountain where they're getting the rock out of. They're either carving it there or transporting it and then carving it in the location in which they're going to install it. These are, by the way, one day when you all go visit the Olmec heads, they're huge. They're 20 feet tall and 20 feet wide. Like these things are huge. Let's see. Did they use logs? So maybe, yeah. It's a maybe. It's very probable that they use logs. What about the Easter Island head? So I don't know about the Easter Island head. Somebody might have to look that up. They're with full bodies. So I don't know the answer to the one about the Easter lights, but think about everything that you needed, all the kind of specialty. You need engineers, right? You need special tools that must have been created by craftsmen to create this. The manpower, of course, and you need the food to be able to feed all of the workers, unless you're just going to let them die. And we didn't find, mass graves of workers, so that's probably not what happened. They were probably fed. You needed so you needed carvers, you needed tool makers, you needed laborers, you needed artists, and you needed rulers and clergy. Right? This tells us that the Olmec were a highly advanced, highly complex society. Now let's talk about Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is another one of these early agricultural places, right? Even earlier than the Olmec, earlier than the Egyptians. What do you know about the Mesopotamians and Mesopotamia? I know you all had this in world history class. Do I need to write your world history teachers and tell them they failed? Oh, there's the chat. Hold on. It means land between two rivers. Yes. The Tigris and the Euphrates. You can cheat and look at the map. And the story of Gilgamesh. Yes, we'll get to the story of Gilgamesh next week. But it's this area in between these two rivers. So again, early agricultural society settled near bodies of water. Right? For the Mesopotamians, it's this area between or around these two rivers, right? So near what is now the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. So these rivers became really, really important in connecting this part of the world, right? You see a kind of a different map of it here that kind of shows you kind of how it's going to interconnect what is now like the Middle East and Asia down to Africa. So this is a key connecting point. This place, the Mesopotamians. So the key here is these two rivers. However, unlike the Nile River for the Egyptians, the Tigris and the Euphrates are really wild and unpredictable rivers. Right? Flooding was really common here. That's terrible because it means that, one bad rainy season would flood your crops and there goes your entire food and livelihood for the entire year. Okay. So what are you going to do? Because it's still an ideal place to live near bodies of water, because it means you can have a constant source of irrigation to water your fields, right? To water your crop. So what are you going to do? Any engineers in the class? How are you going to fix this problem of flooding? If it rains too much, these rivers flood. Let's see, what do you guys say in the chat? Build dams. Yes, control the water flow. That's exactly it. So what they did in Mesopotamia was that they built levees, essentially barriers around the river to block the water from entirely flooding everything. They dug ditches so that the water would pool in an area where they wanted it to pool. And they built canals, right? They would have been pretty rudimentary at first, pretty rough, but they were building canals that would drain away the water out of the fields and out of the area where they're growing, and you don't want too much water there, right? So they have to develop this entire irrigation system in order to control these two rivers, and that's going to require engineers, right? Engineering. So again, the technology is incredibly advanced, right? To us, all of this stuff sounds like nothing because we have that. Most of us don't even think about things like levees or canals or dams or anything like that. We don't have to think about it on a regular basis, but for them, they needed people to sit down and figure out these problems. Otherwise, the community would not have survived. Right? Now, the Mesopotamians don't have the same kind of monumental structure that the Egyptians, the Olmec, some of these other groups have. What the Mesopotamians leave us behind is the structure of their city. Right, so this is what I will say is the equivalent of the monumental structure for the Mesopotamians. It's really complex cities. Right? So we've been able to dig out, the archaeologists have found the layout to Mesopotamian cities. And what we find is that they are laid out pretty much the way you see here, right? Where a temple in the middle, and then usually you have a wall. It's a walled city with homes all around, homes where people live. And then on the outskirts of the walls are the fields, right? Where people would grow. They would grow barley, wheat, sesame. Um, by the way, the fact that the Mesopotamians grew barley tells us that we know they made beer. They grew barley, and with barley, they made beer. But we'll get to the beer later. So, what do you think is more interesting when you're looking at this layout? Pretend you're an archaeologist. What is going to stand out to you about the layout of a city that looks like this? Does anything stand out?
Um,
Yeah.
the one that stand out to me is the structure in the middle. Out of all the structures within the walls, the middle is the largest.
The middle is the largest. This is the temple. So this is where you pay homage to the god or goddesses. Usually, it would vary city from city. It would either be one god or goddess or multiple, but you would leave tributes to a god or goddess. Yeah. Anything else stand out?
I think number 9, right next to it, it looks very empty. Could be sort of like a burial ground.
Oh, it could be. It could be. And that's actually a really good guess because for the Mesopotamians, they tended to bury their dead like in the yard next to the house. So that could be likely. Let me see what you're seeing in the chat. Build dams, control. Oh, number 8 looks super interesting and festive. Number 8 up here. Yes. What could this possibly be? Might be entertainment. That's one possibility. It could be a market, perhaps. Church, a bar. It's probably not the church because all of the religious rituals would be performed around the temple. If the city has a temple, then that would say number 2 says it's a market. You're looking. That's fair. Yeah. So let me ask you this. Let's say you're a Mesopotamian. Where in this city do you want to live?
I feel like myself outside where the crops are, because I think I've read about this, or the inside are more for the, I guess, richer, and then like more like people with power, I would say, and then the farmers in the outside are just like
Yes. This is how we know that the social structure of the Mesopotamians was really complex, because ideally most people will want to live inside the walls, right? The walls mean protection from attacks. Right? You're more protected inside the walls. Right? If somebody's going to attack, they're going to attack outside. They're going to burn the fields. They're going to kill. This is the people that are in most danger. The people inside are the safest. And actually, in a Mesopotamian city, ideally, you'd want to live as close as possible to the temple. Living closer to the temple meant you had wealth and power. Right? So you want to live and be like the inner city. So we know that as we dug out, these cities, that people who were living near the temple had the nicer dwellings. The further you would get from the temple, the lower in status the social groups were. And so this tells us then, if we're able to dig out, all right, which social groups have the most power. Turns out the priest had quite a bit of power, right? Because the religion played a really important part. This also tells us though that how powerful are the farmers?
I think they keep the city running, because without like the farmers' crops
Uh,
go on. I think they do play like an important part, even if they die first.
they are, but you're not thinking like an authoritarian here. They're important, right? Without the crops, if they fail, then nobody eats, right? Nobody eats. But because there's so much farming going on, and because there's so much surplus coming out of the farming, the more the city grew, the more farming and surplus it had, the less important the farmers are in the social structure of the Mesopotamian city. I'm not saying that's right, because yeah, if they all die and nobody's farming, they've got nothing. But in order for a city to reach this level of complexity, means that farming is like an everyday thing. It's expected. People feel like there's no skill in farming. Right? There's a ton of skill in farming, but those farmers would have not been high in status in a Mesopotamian city. Right? They would not have been, um, unfortunately. So we know then there's an increasing level of inequality in Mesopotamia. Right? In terms of religion, right, we know quite a bit about the religion because we have their temples and a lot of that stuff left behind. But for them, it was the religion was trying to figure out the human condition. That's what they really worried about, figuring out, what does it mean to be human, right? Trying to figure out how the world was created and the place of human beings in that world. Right? Key, they really wanted to figure out, like, how do you escape suffering? Suffering was clearly an important part of the Mesopotamian life because a lot of their religious texts are about that, right? This is from later a Greek philosopher, what he wrote about some of this, right? Mm. Let me get a little bit more into their way of life, though. Right? For them, what they figured out, what the religion focused on in terms of the meaning of life, was that in order to escape suffering, in order to live a good life, you had to be one with the gods. You have, well, not one. You had to live in concert with the gods, right? The gods played a very important part of daily life in Mesopotamia. According to the Mesopotamians, the humans were created as co-laborers with their gods, right? And you worked with the gods. Humans were supposed to work with the gods to fight the forces of chaos and keep the community smooth. Right? So they believe that that you had to do things with the god in order to like keep the rivers from flooding. Right? So you have to do your part too. The god does their part, and then together you can stop the forces of nature, the forces of chaos. Right? They also imagine in their creation myth, I'm not going to go into all of their creation myth, though it's really interesting. You can look it up online, but their creation myth is that it all began with an epic struggle between the elder gods and the younger gods. They're engaged in this like epic battle. And because they're fighting, then everything becomes chaotic. Right? Water is in chaos, things like that. Right? So if anybody's interested, I'm like, you should go look at that. It's really interesting. Like the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians imagined an entire underworld, right? And the Mesopotamian underworld was, where the souls departed after a human died, but it was dark. It was a dreary land. And once you got to the underworld, there was no escape. Yeah. But If a spirit had not been honored properly, if the right rituals had not been performed, if the right offerings had not been given, right? If the burial was done wrong, the spirit of the dead person could find a way to hurt the living, right? And the dead were usually buried near the home. So that means that you constantly have to be performing the right rituals and doing the right offerings so to the dead so that they don't come back and haunt you. Right? And so everybody had a duty to be doing this, right? This is everybody was involved in these rituals around kind of appeasing the spirits of the dead. If you offended the dead in some way or another, they believed that the dead could hurt you. Does that sound familiar? It's the same idea we sometimes have when we talk about ghosts, right?
Yeah.
Like it's they're imagining ghosts that come back and hurt you, especially if they have like some kind of like unfinished business type of a thing. I'm like, it's the same idea. I'm like, we like to think that like we're so advanced in everything, and I'm like, and the way we explain like the unexplainable sometimes is the exact same way that these early humans explained it. Right? So what do you think about the Mesopotamian world? Is it better or not as good as the Egyptian underworld?
I feel like there is less, well, because the Egyptian one was that you have to be pure of heart, or it has to weigh lighter, and that means no. If you did something wrong, that's it. There's more trials, but then here it's just like if you mess up even one small
Yeah.
ritual, it's like art guaranteed a hunt.
No, yeah. Carlos says he likes the Egyptian one better. And he says, but in the Egyptian one, you still had to farm. You still had to farm, but if you get buried with the right thing, you could get out of farming. This is why people, when they compare these two underworlds, they say that the Egyptian underworld kind of has a more positive outlook because there are ways out of it, or out of doing some of the trials, out of the farming. Whereas with the Mesopotamian underworld, there's no out, right? Like when you die, you go to the underworld and that's it. If you, and then if your family doesn't do the right rituals, you can come and haunt them and hurt them, but that's it. You're in the underworld. It's done. And I'm like, in that way, like the Egyptian underworld kind of, at least you have a shot at like something a little bit better, where in the Mesopotamians, no shot. Right. And we believe part of it is just the way their world, it's not like the movie Coco. It's not like Coco at all. And that's why we believe that the Mesopotamian world, it's a lot of it had to do with the rivers, because the rivers were so unpredictable, because it required so much engineering. The world of the Mesopotamians was just much more chaotic, whereas the Egyptian world was much more stable, right? And that allowed them to have a more positive outlook about their world and even their afterlife, right? For the Mesopotamians, it's like you die and you escape the chaos of our world, and that's it. That's your reward for how you lived. Right? Really interesting. What do you think about the role of women? Any guesses about what the role of women was like in Mesopotamia? How important do you think the women were? Very important or not so important?
I'm just gonna guess and say not important.
That's always the safer bet within. So, uh, you know, even when women have like an inferior position in societies, a lot of times they're still important. Even in that position of inferiority, they're still important. So it's always a bit of a mixed bag. But one thing that the Mesopotamians allow us to see clearly, and this is something that gets replicated in patriarchal societies all over the world, right? But it's very clear with the Mesopotamians that once a few families started gaining wealth in the Mesopotamian cities, one of their main goals, right? Once the families got rich, and you had a handful of families that were rich, their goal was to keep that money in the family, right? They did not want to spread the wealth to every family in the city. They wanted to protect their wealth and keep it in the family. The main way in which they kept that wealth just to a handful of families, but was through marriage practices, right? So you don't want your wealth to go to any other family. So you make a contract with another rich family and you decide that your kids are going to marry each other. Right? Or if there's a few more rich families in town, then amongst yourselves, you're going to arrange marriages, keep that wealth in your family and make sure it doesn't expand to any other family. And that's one of the main roles of women in the society, because even though, you know, it's a patriarchal society, it's through these marriages that women helped maintain the wealth in the family. That meant though, right? So that's because you want, if I'm going to marry my daughter over to that family over there, then my daughter is going to guarantee that her kids are going to be that guy's, the son's progeny, right? How am I going to make sure that the kids that are born out of that marriage are actually going to belong to these two people? I'll go out of this. This isn't in the screen. How do I make sure, right? I'm going to marry off my kid, somebody else's kid, and that's going to maintain the wealth in the family. But how do we make sure that they're not messing around? That the kids will actually have like our genes? No? Are you all too innocent chaperones? Exactly, though. Virginity. This is where we think the concept of virginity and the importance we attach to it comes into play. You can't do a DNA test. They don't. But then you make sure then that the women do not have any sexual intercourse before marriage. And that guarantees that any kids that she has belong to her husband. Right? And this is kind of one of those things that has always been like puzzling to me about patriarchy. I'm like, the best way to guarantee that the money stays in the family is by a matrilineal line, by making sure that the money goes to a woman's children, not to the children of the man. But like the opposite was true here. They try to guarantee that the man's progeny, right, that his kids are going to be the wealthy ones, by restricting the life of the women, by saying, nope, you have to be a virgin before marriage, and then you can only have sexual intercourse with your husband. Right? Yeah. And then the bleeding, that element of bleeding as being attached to virginity, right? And how much importance that has, even though it's absolutely, the blood and the breaking of the hymen doesn't actually mean virginity, but that's a different topic. Yeah. So it's super messed up, but this is where those ideas originate. So it's not even an invention of like Catholicism or Christianity. These were ideas that people figured out for the reason of maintaining wealth within their family. The other place where we know about the role of women in Mesopotamia is through their writing. Right? The Mesopotamians developed a writing system, and the phrase slave girl, we see in the writing much earlier than we see the word or the phrase slave male. right? Why do you think they wrote about rules or regulations about slave girls sooner than they wrote about slave men? Any ideas why they would do that, or what that tells us?
The lack of freedom that women had.
Lack of freedom. Yeah, we think that for them, a female slave was probably more valuable than a male slave. And so that they had to write rules and regulations for slave girls um, sooner, right? That those were more important. They had to get those written down before they had to get the rules and regulations about slave men written down. So we think that that female slaves would have been more valuable. Right? Female slaves were probably easier to attain. The way people became slaves was through battle, right? One city, one group of people would go to war with another one. Usually the men would get killed and the women would be enslaved. Anyone that was captured ended up as a slave. But we think that because of the way war functioned, that most of the men would die and a lot of the women would then be enslaved. So there was probably more female slaves than there were male slaves. Right? And so it was probably more likely that any number of slaves a family had would have been female slaves, and that they would be more valuable than the male slaves. Right? Slavery, though, I have to say, in this time period, didn't function the way it does in the Atlantic world, right? When you think of like the slavery that the Europeans developed using slaves from West Africa and then brought to the Americas, this is a different kind of slavery, right? Slaves were captured, and you don't want to be a slave regardless of what society you live in, because being a slave is a lot of physical labor and you don't have any freedoms. But now we think that there was different kind of even a hierarchy within slavery, so that some slaves in this world were probably living better lives than others, right? Probably if you're a slave and you're working in the fields, your life's probably not that great. But if you're a slave in a wealthier family, you might have access to a lot more comfort, and you might have even more freedom. A lot of slaves were allowed to like participate in business, to trade, to save up their own money, things like that, that are much more rare in other slave systems. Right? So I want to be clear that I'm not saying slavery was good here. It's not good. You don't want to be a slave regardless, but the system of slavery here would have functioned very differently than later systems of slavery. Right? It's also not based on race. Right? The Atlantic slave trade was entirely based on race, and that was not the case here. Like skin color did not matter. You were a slave if you had been captured during a raid, during a war. Your social status, what it was before, mattered very little. You're a slave now. Right. So basically it's a complex role that women have. Generally here though, that women are prized as a means of keeping wealth within a family. Their virginity is prized as a way of ensuring paternity and the lineage of certain families, right? That doesn't mean though that all women in this ancient world were similarly restrained. Women that lived in Egypt, for example, especially if they lived in an Egyptian city, would have had a lot more freedom and would have basically been pretty equal to men. Right? In less urbanized Egypt, they would have been a lot equal to men. So if you live in Egypt and you don't live in a major city, the chances if you're a woman of having a better place in society increase. Right? What we do know though is that a lot of early laws revolve around marriage. who can marry whom, you know, what kind of social status. And it turns out in Mesopotamia, they cared very much about all those things. Class, right? Social status was incredibly important. The Mesopotamians codified all of their laws in what is known as the Code of Hammurabi. So the Code of Hammurabi is the stone slab. We still have it, by the way. This is the picture that I took of the Code of Hammurabi at the Louvre Museum in Paris. And we've been able to decipher the writing. We've translated most of it, right? And a lot of their laws revolve around like class status, right? So let's look. Let's see. This one says, if anyone strike the body of a man higher in rank than he shall receive 60 blows and an ox whip in public. So if you cause harm to somebody who is higher in status, you're going to get 60 blows with a whip that's going to hurt. If a freeborn man strikes the body of another freeborn man or equal rank, he shall pay 1 gold mina. So if you hit someone of your same rank, you pay a fine. If you hit someone who is higher class than you, you're going to get whipped. All right. What this tells us is class status is really important to the Mesopotamians. All right. So where do you want to live? Egypt or Mesopotamia? No takers, none of them? Egypt. If you're a woman, you really like your chances are way better in Egypt. Do I have to choose? Fortunately, you don't. But this shows us just, even though societies are developing a very similar pattern, right, of developing cities, settling down, complex societies, these monumental structures, they can still be a lot of variety in the way the actual social structure worked, right? Like practically in Mesopotamia, the lives of women which were much more restrained. Family and like that family unit was much more important, especially the wealthier you were in Mesopotamia, the more restricted your life would have been as female. And that doesn't mean that in Egypt women were equal, but some women had a lot more freedom in places like Egypt. Yeah. If you're a slave, where do you want to live? Egypt or Mesopotamia? Not live at all. That one's a little tougher. You really don't want to be a slave anywhere. If you're a slave, you're kind of out of luck almost anywhere. The status of slavery too was not something that was easy to escape. It's more possible, like we'll see in places like Persia. Once we get to the Persian Empire, it was being a slave was a much more fluid status. But in this world, in the ancient world, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, chances were that you were going to die a slave. Lives weren't that long anyway, and so it just meant that you even if you had a chance of making some money or saving some money, that you were probably not going to live long enough to do that. But yeah, that one kind of just sucks overall. So like I said, the reading, let me go really quickly, share the screen and show you, go back to the reading. Oh, again, this picture of the Code of Hammurabi in Paris, and I feel really lucky to have been able to see the stone in Paris, but it was gained through colonialism. And the Europeans did archaeological digs in different parts of the world and then took all of this, what ends up being like really like human history, right? It doesn't belong to any particular group, but they end up taking them to their capitals and keeping them there. It's really um, it's really something that has puzzled me for a long time, why they refuse to give it back. Like it doesn't belong to you, and they just like they won't admit that it doesn't belong to them, right? So in the reading, there are a few questions in here that I didn't touch on, but the questions here will ask you to think about, for example, what the role of women, what the gender hierarchies were in these different places. So you'll be able to do some comparing and contrasting between some of the Hindu laws with Muslim laws and Zoroastrianism. You won't, the only information you'll have on these religions is what's on the reading. And so that's why at the end I'm asking you which of these religions are you more interested in, because we're going to come back to all of them. We're going to come back to the laws of Manu, to the Quran, and to Zoroastrianism, and I want to see where your interests lie in terms of that. And then if you have any questions on any of this, you're free to ask or send me an email, or I do still have office hours tomorrow. I want to show you real quick because I haven't been getting a lot of people coming to my office hours. I'll try to remember to send an email, but it's a different Zoom link for my office hours. And you can find the Zoom link here. Like I won't click on it now because I'm already on Zoom, but if you click like this Thursday 3 to 4, it'll take you to the Zoom in which I hold my office hours. I give all my classes these office hours, and so it has to be a different Zoom link than the one I used for class, but it's always on the homepage. Right? Any questions or complaints? No? Should I be smarter and not ask for complaints? Okay, we stop here. It's going to start getting a little bit more fun. I'm like, I find this period of ancient history really interesting, especially when we're talking about the pyramids or the Olmecs. But starting next week, we're going to start analyzing certain documents and getting a little bit more critical about all of this. So, and really delving more into specific religions. So, buckle your seatbelt. And we're going to be in for a ride next week because we're going to start working on our first paper next week. Right? All right, you're free to go. I'm like, you're all falling asleep. So you're free to go, and I'll see you next week. I'll stop the recording.